to see each of you here this morning. Beautiful fall day. Remember again, I wish to emphasize next week is Family Day, so invite family or a friend to pretend like they're your family to be in worship with us next Lord's Day. And we'll have a special contribution for the children's home, Child Haven, that we will deliver when we take the toys in December, first Monday in December. And we'll have a fellowship meal after services, and then, as Jack mentioned, at 2 o'clock service. More than 30 years ago, Disney World was established in Orlando, Florida. Walt Disney had passed away. Mrs. Walt Disney was invited to the grand opening. And the man who was introducing her made the statement. He said, "I wish Walt Disney had been here to see this." And Mrs. Disney stood up to the microphone and said, "He did." He sat down. Disney World exists because Walt Disney was a man of vision. Konrad Adenauer was the Chancellor of West Germany at the end of World War II. And Adenauer made this statement. He said, "We all live under the same sky, but we all do not have the same horizon." What is your vision for yourself? Where do you see yourself in 5 years? 10 years? 20 years? What do you see yourself being or doing 10 years from now? What is your vision? College students, high school students, junior high students, what is your vision? For our young parents, what is your vision for your family? What do you see your family being in 10 years or 20 years? Because you see, the way we vision our family in 20 years or 10 years or 15 years is going to affect how we treat them as parents today. A lot of parents who discipline their children just discipline their children for the moment. Don't take the cookie out of the cookie jar because I told you not to. Rather than disciplining them with a vision in mind. We don't want our children to grow up being thieves. We want our children to grow up being honest and responsible. So don't take the cookie out of the cookie jar because stealing is wrong. We discipline with the long term in view. And we need to begin our families with that vision in mind. This morning I want us to take a look at the story of Joseph from the book of Genesis. If you'd like to follow along with some of the verses that we'll be looking at, Genesis chapter 37 is the first chapter that begins the series of stories, really one long story, but the series of events in the life of Joseph. When we pick up with Joseph in chapter 37, Joseph is 17 years old. And he has to spend a lot of time with his stepbrothers. The sons of Bilhah and Zilpah in particular are not ideal sons. Joseph goes and spends time with him and pastures his father's flock with his brothers. But if you notice at chapter 37, verse 2, Joseph comes back home and he tells his dad the bad things that his brother's doing. Now, if you had an older brother or sister, a younger brother or sister mainly, you hated it when they tattled on you, didn't you? sense either sometimes. Because he plays favorites. Now, how many times have you seen parents play favorites with the kids and things turn out good? Jacob loves Joseph because he's the son of his old age. He's the son of his favorite wife, Rachel. And so Jacob gives Joseph a multicolored tunic. And the brothers hated Joseph even more. I tell you what, the book of Genesis is filled with dysfunctional families. But God uses them anyway. And Jacob's family is just a little bit dysfunctional. He plays favorites with one son, creates jealousy and hatred among the other brothers, and verse 4 says that they could not even speak well of Joseph. But then God gives Joseph a vision. And I recognize, first off, that Joseph's vision is God-given, which is different than the type of vision that we're going to be talking about this morning. But the principles are the same. And at the end of the lesson, I'm going to give you half a dozen points relative to having a vision for yourself and for your family. God gives Joseph a vision, verse 5. And the first part of the vision, verse 7, is that they are out binding sheaves of wheat, and Joseph's brothers' sheaves of wheat bow down unto him, to his sheaves of wheat. And they get the idea, verse 8, and maybe part of the reason why they're jealous and angry is because maybe they can see this happening in real life. But they get mad at Joseph in verse 8, and they said, "Are you in fact going to rule over us, little brother?" And they get upset. Verse 8 says, they hated him even more for his dreams and for his words. But then, Joseph, he hadn't learned his lesson yet. God gives him another dream, and he shares that dream with his brothers. If it had been me, I'd have thought, I'm just stirring up jealousy with one of my brothers sharing these dreams with him. I think I'll just keep this with myself. But Joseph doesn't. He tells his brothers this other dream that God gave him. And this dream, he sees the sun and the moon and the 11 stars are bowing down to him, which suggests mom and dad, as well as all the brothers, are bowing down to Joseph. Verse 10. Jacob has had a little bit enough of Joseph's dreams, and even Daddy rebukes him. What is this dream that you've had? Shall I and your mother and your brothers actually come to bow ourselves down before you to the ground? And his brothers are jealous of him even more. And yet Jacob does keep these words in his heart. Perhaps he recognizes the dreams are from God, and if they're from God, then there's some message that is involved. But the brothers hated Joseph. There were times when I got mad at my brother. I got an older brother and a younger brother, so I got both ends of it. But Joseph's brothers got so mad at him that they finally decided they were going to sell him into slavery. And they got what? 20 pieces of silver. Now y'all have seen my younger brother. I could probably get 40 pieces of silver out of him. 60 pieces out of my older brother. So they sell him into slavery. And that's how much they hated Joseph. But God was with Joseph when he goes down into Egypt. And eventually he finds himself in charge of the bodyguard of Pharaoh, Potiphar's house. And God is with him. We're going to fast forward to the end of Joseph's life. But God blesses Joseph in everything that he does. In Potiphar's house, but then Potiphar's wife, of course, makes a false accusation against him that he was trying to make advances on her. And Joseph gets thrown into prison for 2 full years. But while he is in prison, God hasn't forgotten him. If you look at chapter later will serve to give Pharaoh reason to believe what Joseph has to say about his dreams. Okay, so when Pharaoh calls Joseph out of prison to interpret his dreams, and you remember the dreams about the fact that there were going to be 7 years of famine, and then 7 years of plenty, rather, in their crops, and then 7 years of famine. And so Pharaoh brings Joseph out, and Joseph interprets those visions. And if you notice in chapter 41, how many times does Joseph give God the credit for interpreting his dreams? Look at verse 16, for example. Joseph says, "It is not in me, God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer." And in verse 25, Joseph says, God has told to Pharaoh what he was about to do. In verse 28, God has shown to Pharaoh what he was about to do. And in verse 32, the matter is determined by God, and God will quickly bring it about. And so Pharaoh puts Joseph in charge. And Joseph sets aside 20% of their crops during those 7 years of plenty. And he makes Egypt the breadbasket of the world. Well, there's a famine in Canaan, north of Egypt, where his dad Jacob lives with his brothers. Jacob hears that Egypt has food, and so Jacob sends the brothers down to Egypt in order to get food. And we see the fulfillment of Joseph's vision, rather, here in chapter 42. Look down at verse 6 of chapter 42. Joseph was a ruler over the land. He was the one who sold to all the people of the land during the 7 years of famine. And Joseph's brothers who come from Canaan came and bowed down to him with their faces to the ground. What's going on? Joseph's vision is coming true. Joseph's dreams are being fulfilled. And Joseph recognizes that if you look at verse 9 rather. Joseph remembered the dreams which he had about him. Joseph sees his vision coming true. And while he was in Egypt, Joseph had a couple of sons. His first son he named Manasseh, reflecting on the past, chapter 41 and verse 51. Because he says, God has made me forget. And he names his second son Ephraim, which means God has made me fruitful in the land. Joseph sees his vision coming true. Do we have a vision today? What kind of vision do you have for yourself today? What is your vision for yourself financially? What is your vision for yourself spiritually? Where do you see yourself 10 years from now? What is the vision for yourself in your social advancement? Again, what is your vision for your family? Where do you see your family when your children graduate from high school? What kind of citizens, what kind of Christians do you envision your children being when they're 25 years old? What kind of adult do you envision your children being when